we have, after weeks and weeks of talking about beginning talks about Ukraine's membership to the European Union, uh, what transpired was a bit strange, or should I say, almost embarrassing. So I don't know if you caught how these talks even got off the ground. And that was they had to Olaf Scholz, the chancellor in Germany, literally had to tell Viktor Orban, a leader of Hungary, out to get out of the room, and that was his concession. He left the room, and they could finally get the talks off the ground. And this has been seen now as this huge victory for Ukraine. Zelensky's on Twitter making videos about how incredible it is that there's this huge step for Ukraine to enter the European Union. But here in the latest article, I almost thought they replaced, because this is what happens sometimes in the Western mainstream media. They'll release an article maybe too prematurely. It's a little too negative, a little too pessimistic, and then they'll scramble and change the headline and attempt to change the article altogether. But in the latest report from Politico, they also emphasize that the European Union wasn't even able to agree, similar to the United States, on the latest aid package for Ukraine, and that it emphasizes also that these are just talks, that this is not a vote on membership at all. And I don't know if you all both remember, just 6 months ago, you had Vladimir Zelensky very angry about how he was treated at the Vilnius summit, the gathering of NATO in July, where he literally talks about how the so-called conditions that NATO is putting in is akin to weakness, saying uncertainty is weakness, and I will openly discuss this when he gets to the summit. He ended up very lonely with the janitor mop meme and all of that, because he had apparently at that time already worn out his welcome. So maybe, Ben, do you want to begin just to react to this? Because I felt like this is just a political ploy, it feels like, to maybe rescue the Ukraine operation to some degree.
Yeah, what would it even mean for Ukraine to join the EU? I mean, what's so funny is the Western media framing about this always misses the forest for the trees. The debate is always about whether or not Ukraine will join the EU. Well, if Ukraine joins the EU, what would that mean for the Ukrainian people? First of all, what will Ukraine look like if and when this war does finally end, which started in 2014, of course. The war did not start with the Russian war in 2022, what they call the special military operation, what the West calls the full invasion without, unprovoked is the term they always use, without mentioning that the war began in 2014. And specifically, the war began because in 2014, because the U.S. sponsored a coup that overthrew Ukraine's democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, who was geopolitically neutral. But an important element of that on the subject of the EU, what initially caused the kind of color revolution protests in late 2013 in Ukraine? It was that Yanukovych, again, the elected independent president of Ukraine, not a Russian puppet. He was geopolitically neutral. In fact, sometimes he carried out decisions in Ukraine that Russia didn't like, but he was not a pro-Western leader. Therefore, according to the Western media, he was a Russian puppet, because if you're not pro-Western, therefore you're a Russian puppet. That's the ideology. That's how Western media outlets think, right? So Yanukovych refused to sign essentially what was a trade agreement with the European Union, which would have been a step toward EU membership, because it required numerous neoliberal conditions. Just as countries that get assistance from the IMF, and IMF so-called bailout, which always includes, political conditionalities, including implementing neoliberal policies, privatization, cutting, social services, cutting government subsidies for food and oil and energy, etc. So in the case of Ukraine, Yanukovych recognized that it would be political suicide. It would be very destructive politically for him to accept those neoliberal conditionalities in order to join or move in a step toward the EU in this trade agreement with the EU, because the EU is a fundamentally neoliberal institution that demands that all members, and especially with countries that are trade partners that are moving toward accession. They have to remove capital controls. They have to end government subsidies for certain strategic industries. They have to remove tariffs and protectionist policies that protect local industries so they can be eaten up by foreign competitors, all of these things. And if you actually care about the well-being of your people, of your working class, no rational government that is accountable to those people would voluntarily implement those neoliberal policies. But what we see now is this Ukrainian regime is implementing all of those and much more. I mean, the shock therapy going on in Ukraine under Zelensky is, I think, one of the less covered issues of this conflict that really needs to be talked about more. Zelensky has been implementing a kind of Pinochet-style program. I mean, mass privatizations of everything, selling it off to Western investors for pennies on the dollar. There's a website of the Ukrainian government. You can find it online where you can find all of these bidding contracts for government property, for state institutions and real estate and such. And they're selling this stuff, especially because of the horrible exchange rate right now, because they're selling it in Ukraine's local currency. But of course, if you buy with dollars, the exchange rate's very favorable. I mean, it's absurd, the stuff that they're selling for pennies on the dollar. They are looting the country. Meanwhile, Zelensky, he virtually opened the New York Stock Exchange, ringing the bell digitally on Zoom. And he gave these speeches about how Ukraine is open for business. We're welcoming $200 billion, $300 billion, $400 billion worth of foreign investment in the country, which is well over 100%, leaning to 200% of Ukrainian GDP. So, I mean, we're talking about Ukraine joining the EU. What will be left of Ukraine? And in order to join the EU, it's going to further continue imposing these neoliberal economic policies that have completely devastated the country. Ukraine right now has some of the most aggressive anti-labor legislation in the entire world. It is, for the vast majority of workers, illegal to form a union in Ukraine. Collective bargaining rights have been suspended perpetually. And even Ukrainian labor unions, which are very anti-Russian and support the government, even they have been publishing press release after press release warning about these devastating policies. So it's so funny because, you know, the West sees joining the EU as something that's inherently good, but all that would do is just further the suffering of the Ukrainian people who already are suffering.
Carl, anything you want to add?
No, I mean, I have nothing to add to that. The most important issue in Ukraine, just like in Gaza, is succession, is ceasefire. China has called for a ceasefire in Ukraine and have offered to negotiate a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine. Russia said it was receptive to that, but again, it's a West. It's a government in London, government in Washington has shown their hostility to any ideas of a peace deal, just like what they're doing right now in Gaza, by the way. And when most of the world's population wants to see peace, wants to see a ceasefire happening, these imperialists, they can't even pretend that they are for peace. You know, even like a toothless UN resolution, which we all know, like nobody give a damn. They would still not bring themselves not to veto a peace deal. I mean, this is, I think especially with what's going on in Gaza right now, the hypocrisy of the West is wide open for everyone to see. I mean, the U.S. and its lackeys are losing tons of credibility right now. And Ukraine is not helping because Ukraine was their biggest project for the last 2 years, and it's failing miserably. And right now it looks like the Ukraine sponsors in Washington are ready to wash their hands because just, you know, there's no competition with Israel. Israel is America's precious. You know, in Ukraine, Taiwan, whoever, I'm sorry, you guys don't even come close to the position of Israel in American politics. So Ukraine is going to have to take a back seat. Russia, I think everybody any clear observers of the war have come to the conclusion that Russia is winning, and we are not talking about when or if. We're talking about how much. What does the Russia winning mean? You know, whether the Russia winning means it holds it holds the current line, or does it mean that Russia will go all the way to Odessa? Because right now it has been a frozen conflict because Ukraine has been offering its male population on a massive sacrificial altar with the material support from NATO. And now the NATO support is drying up. The manpower of Ukraine is also drying up. So how long can Ukraine hold the line? I mean, if Russia decide to launch their own offensive, I don't think there's anything left in Ukraine to hold the Russians back. I mean, if Russia does go ahead and take Odessa and turn Ukraine into a landlocked state, Ukraine is basically done for. It's going to be a rump state. I mean, Europe might still put some minimum support into Ukraine like they do in Kosovo right now. But it would, I mean, Kosovo is not the most hopeful model. It's still, after years of NATO occupation, it's still a land of lawlessness, high crimes, unemployment, and the best hope for Ukraine is immigration. Go get out of the country and go to Europe. And you know, we'll have to see how they fare in the increasing anti-immigration sentiment of Europe today. How long they're gonna be welcome in EU, which is really sad, because that just means the Ukrainian people has been they were the human sacrifice. They were the human sacrifice for the altars of the U.S. empire. But luckily, we may be seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, because the current U.S. imperial system is just not sustainable, just like we're seeing in Gaza as well.
Carl, when you brought up
Danny,
oh no, sorry. Yeah.
Can I jump in for 1 second? I just want to mention that, you know, as part of the move toward Ukraine joining the EU, we should also look at, not only, I mentioned, you know, the neoliberal conditionalities imposed on the country, the mass privatizations, the attack on labor unions and such, but we should also talk about the relationship between Ukraine and the EU and what that economic relationship looks like. I mean, Carl mentioned a key point, which is brain drain. This is a key problem we've seen across Eastern Europe after the overthrow of the Soviet Union and the other Warsaw Pact socialist states, is there's massive brain drain. People, anyone who was trained in, you know, a scientific discipline or engineering or medicine, they went to other parts of Europe or migrated to other countries around the world in search of higher wages, while the countries in Eastern Europe in the 90s were imposing these horrible neoliberal shock therapy programs that bankrupted the population. And what we see in Ukraine is, again, in addition to the physical deaths of thousands and thousands of young Ukrainians, we also see the death of the society, because so many people are just leaving the country. And if Ukraine joins the EU, which also includes freedom of movement, we're going to see a very similar phenomenon where basically any Ukrainian with an advanced education is going to leave the country. It's going to turn into, I mean, we've seen countries like Bulgaria, for instance, which have been completely devastated and just emptied of their population. And also, let's look at the economic relationship between Ukraine and the EU. So basically what's happening, you know, Ukraine is often referred to as the breadbasket of Europe, right? It has a lot. It's one of the world's largest producers of wheat and corn and agricultural products. So what we see is, we were talking about deindustrialization. Going hand in hand with neoliberalism is deindustrialization. And Ukraine used to be a major producer of machine parts and heavy machinery and tractors and, you know, all of these things, especially in the Soviet era, but even until the past 10, 20 years, it had a big manufacturing sector. It produced a lot of metals. It produced a lot of chemicals. Now what we're seeing is that Ukraine is basically just becoming a kind of agricultural export hub in the same way that, you know, in the European colonial era, they turned countries like India, or what at that time had been, you know, the Indian subcontinent, into just these resource extraction hubs for agriculture. So now Ukraine has these since the Poroshenko regime in Ukraine after the coup in 2014. Poroshenko was the billionaire right-wing oligarch. He did eventually sign an economic agreement with the EU for free trade. And now what we see is that Ukraine is sending these agricultural products to the EU. And while the EU is fueling this process of deindustrializing the country. So what we also see is a kind of economic colonization of Ukraine, and the relationship between Ukraine to the rest of Europe is like the relationship of Europe to its colonies 200 years ago.
I mean, that's exactly what happened to much of Eastern Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union. They are now economic colonies of Germany, and the EU. That's a part of the plan incorporating EU into, I mean, Ukraine into EU. But right now we have like a multifractal level of cannibalization. The Europe have feasted upon the carcass of the former Soviet Union and its ally states in Eastern Europe. But right now, United States is cannibalizing its allies in Europe. Yeah. This is a fractal relationship of the imperial hierarchy. So you know you have Germany treating the Eastern Europe as its economic colonies, but at the same time, Germany itself is militarily occupied by United States. And during this war, when Europe was forced to stand with U.S. in sanctioning against Russia, Germany got cut off from its cheap source of natural gas supplies from Russia. So now all the German industrialists are decamping. They're offsourcing their German industries now to United States. So U.S. is essentially cannibalizing its own allies in order to stay, USA number one. And the European elite are so cucked. They cannot say no to United States. They follow along with this plan. You have von der Leyen, you have Joseph Borrell. These guys are just nothing but like spokesperson for Washington interests in Europe. Nobody in the European leadership has a backbone to stand up to United States and say no, and do what is actually right for the interest of the Europeans in EU. So, but this system is not sustainable. Like this multiple level of fractal cannibalization process. The empire is eating. It's consuming everything in its path, including Americans, including average working class Americans, because Americans are not getting healthcare, they're not getting great education. All the monies they print is going directly to the military-industrial complex, feeding all the fat cats, lobbyists in Washington, and all the hanger on all the think tankers they sponsor. And for the rest of us, the best they can do is the poverty. The U.S. poverty alleviation plan is basically military service. You can join the U.S. military. That's a U.S. poverty alleviation plan. I think people are start to seeing through that. I think Ukraine war has opened up a lot of people's eyes in United States, even among like the right-wing circles, right? I mean, like right now, like opposition to Ukraine war is almost across the political spectrum. Both the left and the right says this is a bad idea, but the delusional leadership in Washington who are so cut off from the average reality of Americans, they're still dead set on pursues their imperial pursuit, because that's what fattened their own pockets, and ultimately that's very short-sighted. So the Ukraine project is failing. There's no end in sight. I mean, I don't see a win, quote unquote, a win for NATO or EU in this point, other than maybe just their if they just want something, they just want a thorn on Russia's side to bleed Russia dragged Russia into a quagmire. But I don't think their own economy could support that, because we have seen, because of deindustrialization in both United States and Europe, they can, the combined mind of NATO cannot even supply simple thing as artillery shells for Ukraine. I mean, after all the deindustrialization of the destruction of the Soviet military industrial complex, Russia can still outproduce United States and Europe in terms of, basic tanks and artillery shells. So that's it really shows the U.S. imperialism ultimately is a paper tiger.
And I just
Danny,
wanted to.
Can I just have one brief comment?
Yes.
What Carl is saying is also confirmed by an article that was published a few months ago by Politico that acknowledged that the Biden administration internally, when it's lobbying members of Congress to support sending more weapons to Ukraine, the Biden administration is telling Congress members, this is going to be great for the economy because we can bring back industrial jobs to, some of your districts. But of course, their solution for reindustrialization is further militarization. So the only form of reindustrialization they support is again, fattening the bank accounts of the military industrial complex. And this is just military Keynesianism. The only kind of state support for, industrial policy and certain strategic parts of the economy are for the industries that are for war. That's the U.S. ideology.
This is because the U.S. capitalist class is so unconstrained, but the only force in the United States that can hold them in check is the military-industrial complex, is the national security crowd. You actually had Gina Raimondo recently explaining her rationale for expanding this tech sanction on China. Like people are asking, like the U.S. tech companies are hurting. NVIDIA is prevented from selling to one of their largest natural market on AI chips. And Gina Raimondo basically says, sorry, U.S. business just have to suck it up for national security because democracy. The democracy she's talking about, of course, is about the great choice between Biden and Trump, in 2024. But that's what really. But the only thing that basically that could hold the rest of the U.S. capitalist class in check is the Pentagon, the military intelligence industrial complex. Again, that's just kind of shell games. It's just shifting the resources from one sector of the economy to all the weapon manufacturers, but because that's the only thing that's produced in U.S. nowadays, weapons and OnlyFans. That's the support of the U.S. GDP, and
well, Carl, don't forget Netflix. Come on, Netflix.
I'm sorry.
We have to have season 8. We have to have season 8 of The Floor is Lava or whatever. One, I swear, final quick note. Carl mentioned Gina Raimondo's comments. This is the U.S. Commerce Secretary. She also said in those comments, she said that China is the greatest threat the U.S. has ever seen. She said that. And of course, she said that the U.S. wants to prevent China from innovating technologically. So much for the free market, right? They don't actually want competition. That's the goal, is to prevent China from competing with U.S. big tech monopolies.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. And I just wanted to, Carl, when you were talking about the kind of hierarchy of the cannibalism of the empire, and in many ways, kind of pushing EU accession for Ukraine in this period where obviously things are quite stark and going quite badly for Ukraine and for the overall Ukraine project. It is a huge contrast to the terms and conditions and everything that the United States has put in front of Ukraine for NATO for obvious reasons. But it's all about Ukraine. It's got to get rid of that corruption. It's not time yet. But the European Union, I think what the United States is really saying here is not only are they trying to wash their hands of Ukraine, but they are more than happy to continue this process of weakening and devaluing the European Union, really cementing its role as kind of the cleanup crew of the empire, when it itself is looking more and more like the carcass that you were talking about, Carl.
Well, that's a plan all along. I mean, I remember in 2000, in early 2000, I was actually working in Hamburg, Germany. At that time, when EU was just coming into form, and then there was actual fear in the U.S. talking circles about how this could possibly present as a counterweight to United States, and possibly a path lead down to European independence from the U.S. foreign policy goals. So what U.S. has done in the past 30, 20 years is that they have infiltrated all the Europe through sponsoring all these Atlanticist institutions, which produce creatures like von der Leyen or like Baerbock. And I mean, these are all creatures from these Atlantis institutions, and they infiltrated all levels of EU and European government. So now all they have is yes men and yes women to Washington in all levels of European government. And actually, I frankly, I don't know how European voters put up with this shit, man. That I mean, this is it's unfortunate because right now this is also behind the shift to the right-wing politics in Europe, because these people, they don't have they are trying to seek alternatives to the current the neoliberal elite that's ruling over them. Instead, they're getting swindled by all these just racist populist rising tide of outright in Europe. It's also happening in the United States, by the way. I mean, this is why we end up with choice with Biden or Trump, even though majority of Americans knew there's something deeply wrong with this country, right? But I think that this also speaks to a lack of a real opposition in all these developed countries. But so now we have all these. The imperial project is kind of sitting adrift. We're headed by this senile old man who doesn't know what he's talking about half the time, and there's really no grand vision for the U.S. empire other than let's keep U.S. number one. That's the only vision. Whereas China, they're actually coming up with the slogan, the community, the shared future for the mankind, which is a grand vision, and they are talking about building a pan-Asian rail links that will have high-speed rail running from Shanghai to Singapore. Now that is a grand vision. That is a vision for the future, vision for development that people can get excited and look forward to. And the U.S., the only thing they can offer is war. More war, more weapons.
Carl, and season 8 of The Floor is Lava. I mean, come on.
Yeah.
You have to give them some credit for that. I just want to briefly, if I can share my screen for a second as well. I want to briefly show an incredible article that was published by the European Council on Foreign Relations. This is a mainstream think tank in Brussels that is funded by all of the major EU states. This is like the US Council on Foreign Relations. It's obviously based on it. This represents the elite of Europe. And they published an article this April titled "The Art of Vassalization: How Russia's War in Ukraine Has Transformed Transatlantic Relations." Now, they of course blame Russia for this, but regardless of that propaganda of blaming Russia for everything, they acknowledge that Europe is becoming an American vassal. That's the quote. Europe is becoming an American vassal. They acknowledge that this war in Ukraine has revealed Europeans' profound dependence on the U.S. for their security, despite EU efforts at so-called strategic autonomy, which has never happened. The EU has grown less powerful than the United States economically, technologically, militarily. So this is a clear acknowledgement that the U.S. is kind of like colonizing Europe. by European elites.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHaiFong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.